Hey, well, welcome back. We're glad to be with you on this Thursday afternoon. And I'm Bob, joined here with Todd. And this is the MBC Pastors Podcast. We are coming to you from Comstock Park, Michigan, just outside of the great city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Hope you guys are doing well today. So we are continuing our series. We're talking about singleness. We're doing hopefully 5. So we did 2 before. We're going to have this one and then 2 after. So we're kind of shifting our focus a little bit, going from like a biblical foundation to what singleness is, to now we're going to be this time we're going to be looking at the different models for like dating, courtship, what that actually means. And then we'll look into what do we look for, what does somebody look for in a mate, and then eventually how do you move from single into married. So we'll look at that as well. But as I said, today we're going to be looking at the biblical model for going from single to married. What does that look like with regards to dating, courtship? Now, on the onset of this, it's important to point out this isn't just for single people, right? So for parents, much like yourself, have teenagers, or myself that may have teenagers if the rapture doesn't come.
Good point.
So if you do have kids or you're planning on having kids, we're hopeful that this will be helpful to you as well, that you can grab some pointers from here.
Yeah, because these are things you have to talk about with your teenagers.
Absolutely.
These are topics that they're wrestling through and thinking through. I remember as a college pastor, this probably was the topic we got questions about most, was how do you go from single to married in a God-honoring way? And so I like what you said about parents need to be equipped in this as well. So we hope that this is useful to the parents who might be listening as they bring up their kids and give them some resources for how to think about this.
That's good. And grandparents.
Yeah.
And maybe you can talk to your grandkids. So,
Yeah.
So the first thing we want to talk about is do we have biblical principles for or a biblical model for going from a single into a married? And if you were to go on to your search engine for your Bible, right, I use Logos or whatever, and you type in dating, how many search results do you find?
0.
You find 0. So we're not supposed to date.
Yeah, well,
That wasn't in our notes.
if you're a parent, that's an easy way to solve that problem.
Right. No. So, but we want to look at some of these models, right? So in biblical times, now I'm reading off of your notes here, okay? So biblical times, a dowry was paid, a sacrifice was made, and spouses usually didn't see each other until they were married. And we know in the Bible, sometimes they didn't maybe see each other until even after the consummation of the wedding, right?
That's true.
And so that's how the prescribed model in the Bible was. And so let's go through some of those, what they look like.
Yeah, so maybe back up just a little bit. You know, when we talk about how to go from single to married, I believe that there are biblical principles in the Bible for how to do that. So you said, does the Bible talk about this? In that sense, yes, but in the sense of is the word dating occur in the Bible? No.
Right.
But I do think there are biblical principles that help us inform how that process should happen. But I think it's important even at the beginning to say it can still be a difficult and awkward process.
Of course.
So you have 2 single people and they're both wanting to pursue a possible relationship. How do you begin that initial conversation? How do you navigate those early months of dating? What do those discussions look like? How do you come to a point where you think maybe that you want to progress to marriage? That can be a very awkward, difficult process.
Yeah.
But not impossible, obviously, because
not, right.
many people get married. So what we want to talk about are just some of the models that really help us, or do they help us navigate this? And as you said, really the only model we have in Scripture is betrothal.
Right.
The one that was really put in place in the Jewish culture was betrothal. And obviously we don't live in a Jewish context anymore, so that is not a biblical model that probably most people are going to follow.
Right. No, that's good. And I think it's important that when you say it's awkward, and I think the reason it's awkward is because the culture we live in, our culture really hasn't adapted here's the way you do it model. So it's been kind of this kind of mixture. We take a few pieces here and there, but when you look in the Bible, it's kind of, as you say, you're just betrothed to this woman, and that's how it kind of went forward. But especially in our American culture, in other cultures maybe they have that set way, but in our American culture, the reason why people don't know what to do is because It hasn't been set forward as set in stone, and here's how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we do want to get some principles from here.
Very good.
So let's look at a few examples. We do have examples in the Bible. The Bible certainly gives us different models for going forward, and some of these probably won't make much sense for us today.
Yeah.
And but at the end of the day, it's good to know because there are hardliners out there to say the Bible says this is how you're supposed to do it. And I think it's important also to point out we have to make sure we're not confusing what the Bible is describing happening versus what it's prescribing us to do. And so if we're looking at these just on the onset, there's no commands in here.
That's right.
It's simply just saying, and as you pointed out, in the Jewish culture, here's how it was done, but it was never a thus saith the Lord, here's how you are to do it.
And you're not going to find that anywhere in the Bible with any model. So you're correct in saying that the Bible does not give us one specific model for how to do this. And so maybe we can let the cat out of the bag here just a little bit, but the summary, here's where we're going in this podcast, and what we want to kind of land on is it's not the process you use, but it's the person that you are.
That's good.
So we could probably end the podcast right here
Right.
and say that's essentially it. But when you come to Scripture, that's why there is no biblical model, because it's more important about the kind of person that we are in that process than it is which model we actually employ. But having said that, there are all kinds of models in the Old Testament, particularly, and so maybe we can have fun a little bit with some of these.
Absolutely.
But what about Adam and Eve?
Well, that one was one of my favorites reading through here. And this one, obviously, as the notes say, it would be a difficult model to imitate. As a man, we would have to be put into a deep sleep. We would have to have some sort of supernatural surgery to remove our rib. And then when we woke up, Viola, wife.
Yeah, I mean, there's a model.
There's a model, yes.
So probably not going to happen,
Yeah.
obviously, but there is a model for how the first man went from single to married. So
Right.
his rib became his spouse.
That's right.
Not going to happen today.
Not going to happen. So Cain and his wife, how did Cain get married?
Well, he married his sister. Talk about awkward.
Talk about awkward.
So yeah. The only people have speculated for years about where Cain got his wife,
Right.
but the only conclusion can be obviously it was his sister. Adam and Eve had other children beyond Cain and Abel. We know they had Seth as well. Likely had daughters as well. So clearly we have to believe that Cain's wife was his sister. And so if you say, well, there's a biblical model, there's a model for you, and I'm suggesting that probably most people aren't going to want to follow.
Unless you live in like the southeastern. Anyway.
Yeah, right.
So then you have Isaac and Rebekah. This one people have kind of talked about a little bit. Hey, I Isaac, take thee Rebekah, right? Some books written about this.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that have to say? Genesis 24.
Well, the example there, of course, is, Abraham told his son Isaac to go back to their homeland where they were from, and he was to go to the place where his ancestors were from and take their camels with him, and whenever a person showed up to offer to water the camels, that would be the person who Isaac was to pursue and ask and get to know and would ultimately become his wife. Of course, that was Rebekah. And so there you have a model. There's a way for one man, Isaac, going from single to married, and so you have a model there, but it's not the biblical model.
Well, this would be similar to I go to a gas station and I wait for someone
To fill your tank
to fill
up
up
with
my
gas.
tank, and that woman who fills up my tank, that's the one I'm supposed to
Good
marry.
luck with that one. Especially with gas prices the way they are.
Yeah, she'd be well worth it at that stage,
Yeah,
right? And then, we have Jacob, and then Jacob had a 2-for-1 deal.
He had a coupon.
He did have a coupon for marriage. So you have Rachel and Leah. So how would you follow this model?
Well, you can't unless you're going to marry two wives at once. And so obviously the awkward situation here was he followed a similar model as his father Isaac did and went back to their homeland and thought he was marrying Rachel when on the wedding night found out he was marrying Leah. And so he ended up working 7 years to marry Leah, thinking it was Rachel, ended up then marrying both of them and working an additional 7 years for Rachel. So there's a model. Scripture gives us a model there, but again, no one's going to follow that model today.
Right. It is a good principle. Work 14 years for two wives, especially the one you love.
Well, yeah, but not the two part. What about Samson?
So Samson's one of my favorites, right? I love what he says. I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me, for she looks good to me.
He didn't beat around the bush.
He didn't beat around the bush. That was, we would say maybe caveman style.
Yeah.
That he saw the
we
woman.
don't believe in cavemen.
Right,
but
right,
the
right.
idea.
Yeah. The proverbial caveman
Right.
style. Yeah. Give me this woman, grab her by the hair, bring her back. But he was actually talking to his family.
parents.
Yeah, and saying, go and get this lady.
It's a
for
very
me."
blunt approach.
It is. That it could work. Maybe.
I wouldn't recommend it.
I wouldn't recommend it. Not if you love her, right?
Right. Right.
And then the sons of Benjamin. And you actually labeled this one as an advanced game of tag.
So this was back 20 years ago when I preached on this.
I like
and
that. I
yeah.
like that though. It's good.
So here's the passage, Judges 21. They instructed the Benjamites, saying, "Go and hide in the vineyards, and watch when the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing. Then rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin." So that is kind of a game of tag, I guess, but
now they get some sort of personal protection order.
for sure,
Probably if you're peeping through the vineyards.
it's called stalking.
It's called stalking, not just because you'd be in a cornfield either, right?
Right,
So
for
yeah,
sure.
you'd be stalking. So then you had, and one of the gentlest ones we have, the most perhaps romantic one that we have, most submissive one we have, is that of Ruth and Boaz.
Yeah, and sometimes she gets portrayed in a negative light
Right.
by how she went about that. But of course, you remember the story that she was married to a foreigner and he died, and so she, being a Moabitess went back to Israel and with Naomi, and they found out that there was a kinsman redeemer, a near relative, and so Naomi says to Ruth, "Well, go and lay down next to his feet at night, and when he awakens, ask him what you are asking for." And of course, Boaz awoke, and there's a woman lying at his feet, and she told him about her situation, and he, being a godly man, went and sought out another nearer relative. And after that person said they was unwilling to redeem her, then Boaz did, and of course they got married, and one of their children was David, or down the line was David. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful picture, but again, it's a model. It's not the model for how to go from single to married. So
Yeah, we wouldn't recommend going into some guy's house as a lady
yeah,
and sneaking into his bed and sleeping by his
there
feet.
might be some laws against
There
that.
might be a few laws, even hygienically, I perhaps wouldn't support that. So,
How about someone's that weren't on this list? How about David?
so David marrying
Bathsheba.
Bathsheba. Yeah, obviously that is a model, so to speak.
Problematic.
Definitely problematic. We would obviously not support that model, but
Finding a guy, murdering him,
yeah,
and then
finding
marrying
a wife and then, or finding a lover,
right.
and lustfully seeking her, and then getting some information about her husband, and then murdering him essentially when he's being honorable
In war.
in war,
Yeah.
and then taking on his widow as your bride. Yeah, obviously it's not. It's not.
But
the
it's a
direction.
model.
It is a model. You could even talk about Solomon,
Yeah.
and I mean Solomon. You read Song of Solomon, and you see this beautiful picture of marriage, right? And then you read Solomon's life. It's not so beautiful.
Yeah, 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yeah.
And 1 Kings 11 says that they drew his heart away from
right.
the Lord. So, but here's a model of a man who went from single to married and then kept going and adding to that. So clearly not a model any of us would follow. But
Yeah, I would only add too, is Solomon he started out desiring wisdom, and yet he was still drawn away to other gods by the women in his life.
Right.
And so what a good principle, being careful of the people, the spouse, the man or woman you have in your life, that you may think, hey, I'm going to stand strong, even though they're a worshiper of a different God.
Yeah.
And Solomon, with the wisdom of God endowed upon him, still chased after
wisest
the
man
idols.
who ever lived prior to Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet he still fell for it.
Yeah. One other one I was thinking of was King Ahasuerus in the story of Esther.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how he held a beauty contest?
He did.
And
After
whoever
he booted his first
after he
wife.
booted his first wife, held a beauty contest
Right.
and chose Esther.
That's good.
And she became his wife through that method. So,
Right.
So, I mean, we had some fun with that, and we kind of went through a bunch of different models. But what's the point in saying all those things? The point is there is no biblical model.
Right.
That there's not one proper biblical model for how to go from single to married. And so at that point, then you have to start asking the question, what are some of the principles which we want to flesh out at some point in the near future? But there is no one.
Before you move to that, though, this is all Old Testament.
Yeah.
So what do you see in the New Testament? What model do you see there?
Well, I think you have to ask the question then, who are the married people that we know of? You see Priscilla and Aquila, but we don't know how they were married. Two godly people, obviously, and at some point they got married. Christ wasn't married. We don't think Paul was married, although possibly. We don't have a lot of examples in the New Testament.
Joseph and Mary are the only two I can think of.
And they were very godly, godly. By the way, teenagers.
Teenagers, yeah.
Probably 13
yeah, exactly.
and 16.
Yeah, she was probably 13.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you don't, and you see him even being godly after she's pregnant and not wanting just to cast her off. So he still had that heart of righteousness to do the right thing.
Right.
So even going from the Old Testament, so you could rightly, I don't like using the word assume, but rightly assume they were still practicing these Old Testament principles, even going up into the New Testament. And since it's not hit on again in the New Testament, we don't see a marriage anywhere. In fact, the greatest marriage we see is the marriage of Christ and his church, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's pictured in the New Testament.
And the future marriage supper of the Lamb and all of that. But yeah, the only model you have at the start of the New Testament is betrothal.
Yeah.
And that's what Mary and Joseph, of course, were engaged to be married, which was essentially a betrothal. So that brings us to the contemporary models.
Right.
And I think maybe it'd be helpful just to talk through those just a little bit, the social models. So essentially today we have one, maybe two models, courtship and dating. So
yeah, I was thinking about this too when I was in my office kind of reading this over. We do have courtship and dating, but there's also this other one of just kind of playing the field.
Oh yeah.
Right? So you're not really dating, you're not really courting, you're not really, I mean, you want to get married at some time, but you don't really want to settle down.
It's cohabitation.
Cohabitation.
So that's maybe the broad or the most clear expression of that model would be cohabitation,
Absolutely.
where you're kind of functioning like a married couple.
Right.
Without the commitment of marriage.
Right. No paper.
No paper, no covenant.
No ring. Right.
No ring, no ceremony, no witnesses. It's like a cheap version of marriage.
Yeah.
And it violates all kinds of biblical principles about purity and sexual purity in the context of your singlehood and all of those things. So yeah, you're exactly right. That is actually one of the prevailing models today outside of the church in contemporary culture is cohabitation. Very common.
And they have the highest divorce rate once they do convert from cohabitation to marriage.
Sure.
Because nothing changes when they get married.
Right.
Because they've been living together and there's not that newness and that, love and biblical principles and all of that as well.
That's right. So another model you have, maybe not as popular as it was 20 years ago, but the whole courtship model. Probably popularized most by Joshua Harris in his book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And of course, that was a reaction against the dating movement, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the whole courtship model was essentially a parentally supervised relationship that was viewed as a preparation for marriage. So I think what you had in the whole courtship purity culture situation was we don't want to have all the problems associated with dating. So parents would essentially engage in kind of a contemporary model of betrothal, and they would help their young people find a potential spouse, and they would kind of supervise that relationship, and that father would help his son win a daughter's heart, and it was kind of all parentally involved, and so. Did it help solve maybe some of the dating issues? Perhaps it did, but I think you had another issue there. You have the issue of, well, what about your heart and your affections?
Right.
You can't force that, and so there's a human element to that of wanting to love someone and maybe have your heart engage them. Well, maybe that can happen in a betrothal setting, and certainly in Mary and Joseph's case that did, but I think you have many examples where that didn't work out that way as well in our contemporary culture.
Yeah, and so that's some of the negatives,
Right.
right? And some of the positives though is you did have a desire for godliness, you had a desire for holiness, a desire for purity, and so then you would have the problem is when you bring sinful people into a good system,
Right.
with anything you do, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you did have a decent system where you were supposedly having older, godly parents who were then shepherding their children. The issue is if you're not shepherding the heart, as you said. So if you're not shepherding the heart, but you're only saying, what do you have in common with each other? Or, what are your future goals? And those are all good things, but that can't be why you get married.
Yeah.
And so they weren't looking at the heart in those areas.
Yeah, and of course, there are many young people who are going to rebel against their parents at that age and that whole process as well. So definitely not a biblical model. I think it was assumed to be a biblical model by many in that contemporary scenario, but it's not a biblical model.
Have you seen this yourself? Have you seen like
Courtship?
Yeah,
We've known some people that have done it.
yeah.
I can tell you the few of the few couples that we're aware of, a couple of them had some significant problems early in their marriage because they didn't really cultivate a relationship. It was kind of set up and
Almost arranged.
It was almost arranged, and they kind of went along with the motions that the parents wanted them to, but their hearts never really drew towards one another, and they didn't really develop a close relationship. And so by the time of the wedding, it really wasn't that healthy of a situation. So could it work? Absolutely, but not a guarantee that it would.
Cool. And then we have dating. So you have the courtship model and dating. Dating's actually been around since the 1700s. I looked it up, like officially in writings or whatever. Maybe before that in culture, but as far as like being promoted as an acceptable way for society to meet one another, would be in the 1700s. I actually found this old flyer from 1904 on how a man is to kiss a girl.
Really?
Yeah, so they would have handed out these flyers, and it was funny. The first thing said, "Look at her." Second thing was, "Don't ask her." Third thing was, "Lean in and kiss her." Right? So I thought that was kind of funny. So dating, right? We would say this is probably widespread in our culture. The number one thing we're talking in the church, of hey, let's go out on a date, right?
Sure.
And so how would we describe kind of the pros and cons of dating?
Well, as you said, it is the contemporary model. It's the one that everyone's familiar with, and so it's just the natural model that people are going to use. Does it have some benefits? Well, sure. You can get to know someone in an exclusive relationship in a way that you can't in a group setting. Can you spend some time really getting to know their heart and developing a relationship? Absolutely. There's some good things, but I think the negatives outweigh the positives. But I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater either, because you have to go from single to married somehow.
Somehow, right?
Right? So there's got to be some process that you use to meet someone, get to know someone, develop a relationship with them, have the conversations about what it means to be married and biblical principles. And so it's a model, but again, the issue is the person that you are, not the process you use. But here's some of the pitfalls of the dating model. One would be defrauding. And I say that because of what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He actually uses this issue, defraud. He says, this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God, and that no man transgress and defraud his brother in the matter, because the Lord is the avenger in all those things. So one of the problems that you run into with that model is the potential of defrauding a brother or sister in Christ. And I think this comes from the failure to recognize that you're dating someone else's spouse until you say, I do.
I think that is so key, because people don't realize, like, if you're not getting married, that's somebody else's spouse.
Exactly. So the question we have to ask is, how do you want someone treating your spouse?
That's right.
And that's how you should be treating that person's potential spouse or another person's potential spouse. So this is the breakdown of that model. It can easily lead to what I would call serial monogamy or recreational dating.
Yeah.
Where you pair up with someone for a little bit of time, you get to know them, you kiss, you hold hands, you exclusively date Something happens along the way where you realize this isn't going to work out. You break up, then you move on to the next person, and you do the same thing with them, and then the same thing with the next person. So you have these serial dating relationships that really aren't taking serious what the purpose of that whole process is for.
That's
What
right.
is the process for? It's to test the waters for marriage. And I think in many circles, particularly outside of the church and even within the church, I think there are many people who just want to do the dating thing
Right.
without really the serious intent
'Cause
of,
it's fun.
yeah, because it's fun and everyone else is doing it and I want to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. But they're not serious about testing the waters for marriage. So what that leads to is defrauding someone. You're
That's right.
taking from somebody something that belongs to their spouse in the future.
That's right.
Even if that relationship is above board physically, and in most cases it's not, but even if it is, that person has the potential to give their heart away to that individual, which should be done only for that person's future spouse. So one of the issues of the current dating model is the whole defraud situation. Then secondly, another D is the desires. You have the whole issue of, are the desires driving this dating relationship even biblical? Or is it just infatuation? Like, I really like how you look, or you're attractive, or I like what you do to me by me being paired up with you. The desires are completely, in many cases, not right. They're wrong-headed. And then the last one would be, for a believer, I would say that one of the pitfalls is distraction. And, when I see a young couple in the church pair off and become so exclusively involved with each other that they pull back from the church, there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
They're missing body life. They're missing the fellowship of the body. They should be serving the church, using their gifts to minister to the body, pouring their life into other people. And what oftentimes happens is those two people get so focused on each other that they withdraw from the body. And instead of that relationship contributing to their usefulness to the kingdom, it actually makes them less useful to the kingdom because they're so focused on each other.
Yeah, that's good.
So all of that goes into what I would say are some serious pitfalls and problems of the current dating relationship, dating model.
So what have you told your teenage daughters? You have two sons out of the house.
Yep.
So you can't do a whole lot with that. But your daughters are coming up. They're going to want to get married, I assume, go down the normal path. So what advice have you given your teenage girls?
Yeah, even the boys that are out of the house, we've asked them, and we've tried to talk about these things with them and have these conversations with them, and we've just asked them respectfully to not date until they're ready to test the waters for marriage. And so the question we've had our kids try to wrestle through is, at what point are you ready to test the waters for marriage? So for our boys, that then begs the question, well, when am I mature enough to handle a relationship like that? And when can I provide for a wife and family and kids if they were to come along? And when is my character at a place where I'm able to say to them, follow me as I follow Christ? Not obviously we're all in the process there, but those are some of the key questions they have to ask. For a young woman, when is she ready to pursue marriage? When does she have the character ready to step into that relationship? When is she ready to embrace the principles of biblical femininity? When is she ready to be a mother, which could come very soon after being married? So you have to start asking yourself those questions. When are you ready to test the waters for marriage? And in my mind, I don't see how a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old
Right.
or most 17 or 18 or 19-year-olds are ready culturally or ready maturity-wise or ready spiritually to do that. Now, am I going to lay down a hard, fast line that say that every parent that's doing that or allowing their teenagers to do that is in sin? I'm not going to say that.
Of course.
But I think these are some of the things you have to wrestle with.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. It's very, very helpful. And so where, I'm just trying to think, just in the last couple of minutes here, we have single people. We've been talking about singles, talking to singles, seeing how they can serve in the church. And, I met my wife. She was the only single girl in a very small church. So she didn't have a
Worked out
lot of
well for
options.
you.
Well, yeah, she didn't have a lot of options. So, when you're the only option, there's nothing to compare it to.
So go to a church that has one other single person.
Go to a church, find it with the one single person, and then they have
like
to, by default, take you.
There you go.
So it was a little bit different, but you have a church. We have a lot of singles. And what would you say? They come up and they say, "Hey, Todd, I'm really struggling to meet somebody. I want to meet somebody so I can start to see that process of getting married. I have a desire to get married, like we talked about in the last couple of podcasts. So now I've got this desire. I'm not going to sleep, at a guy's foot of his bed. I'm not going to fill my camels up or anything like that. I need to find somebody. Where's a good spot that you could say?"
Well, I think first of all, you have to get your heart in a place where you're really going to trust the Lord for that. Because it can easily happen where a single person begins to think, well, I'm not in the right place, so I need to go to a different place. I need to move somewhere, or I need to go to another social setting, or I need to figure out a bigger pool of people so I can increase my odds. There may be some element of truth to that, but listen, if God's going to bring you a spouse, He can do that wherever He wants to do that.
Right.
He can do that in a really small church. He can do that if you're in the military and not in a church, and bring you a godly spouse. He can do that in a church with 2,000 people. So I guess the first thing I would say is that person has to be willing to be content and trust the Lord that wherever they are, the Lord can bring them a spouse. But practically and specifically, I would say to the singles of our church, you should look for a fellow believer in the church. In our church, or if not in our church, another fellow believer in another body that you're aware of. And I would say to those people, just serve the Lord together and see what the Lord does.
Yeah.
Serve the Lord. Throw yourself into the life of the church. Throw yourself into ministries here. Disciple people. Be discipled. Engage with fellow believers in the life of the church, and then watch each other. The church is the best laboratory, I hate to use that word, but organism for seeing the character of a person come out. You're going to see what they think about the church. You're going to see how they care for people. You're going to see what they think of corporate worship. You're going to see how they respond to the word by talking about spiritual things together. So the best place, if you want to specifically talk about places, is the church.
Yeah.
But don't look at the church as a pool
of
people to find your spouse. Look at the church as a place where you're going to throw yourself into and serve, and then at some point you might be running forward for the kingdom and turn to your right and see your left and see someone who's also doing the same thing, and you say, wow, that's a potential spouse right there, because our heart beats the same way.
No, that's good. I think that's great. So in summary, as you said at the beginning, not the model you use, but the person you are. And we're going to flesh that out a little bit over the next 2 podcasts. Next one, we'll talk about what to look for in a potential spouse. You'll be amazed. We find it right out of the Bible, what you're to look for in a potential spouse. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. As we said, if you're single or parents or grandparents of kids, hopefully that'll help you shepherd a little bit as you're looking to move into those teenage years where all of a sudden dating becomes the social norm, and you can put some biblical principles in there. So I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.